everyone, welcome to part 2 of the Src Chassis Eliminator PRO chassis. This is attempt number 3 to make this video. The first time my battery died, the second time when I was making the video, somehow I managed to delete the video. So this is my third shot at this, so if you are seeing this, this was third time is the charm. But this time I'm going to be using this Belvedere GTX. It is just about the same length as that Challenger was. I actually did a truck before and it was pretty close to the same length as well. It's pretty much already prepped and ready to go, just how we ended video 1. So this one's going to be just soldering it together and mounting the chassis to this body once the chassis is fully soldered. So this is go number 3. I like to use my gloves that I have here, just basic black nitrile like mechanics gloves. This isn't my favorite brand, but I just had them in the garage and an extra box. My other 2 attempts I went over also. This flux here, it works okay. I guess I don't really know if it could work better. It's been so long since I've used any other flux. The other one that I did really like, but it's really been so long since I've used it. It's actually like a paste that comes in a little syringe that you can get. I really want to get some more of that, but I just have had this, so I figured use this up and then order some of that. But this stuff is really nasty stuff. I mean, as you can see, I'm wearing a hoodie because last time, even when I was soldering my chassis, just from it kind of splattering around and getting on my arms, and it was burning my arms. So just kind of best way to try and prevent getting, having your skin irritated, or depending on I don't think it necessarily really burn you, but it definitely irritates my skin anyways. So using this up, I just use a little paintbrush, kind of dab on all of my spots just to get an initial little bit of flux on it. It's one of those things also where I don't know if my soldering iron is hot enough, or if the material that I'm soldering is a little bit thicker than normal, but it takes a while for it to actually take and smooth out really nicely. So I'll take and actually solder some, kind of quench it almost. You can hear it kind of sizzle when I'll solder, quench it with the flux, and then kind of keep going back and forth until it lays out nicely. Trying to think of any other tips. I always work from the front to the back. I'll go do the guide tongue, then this front section, then do a little bit on the back side there, and then do the wheelie wheel bracket. Then once that's done, I'll I'll solder up the sides here for the little bearing struts, I guess, or bearing plates. I'll solder those to the motor plate to make the entire motor box itself. Then pull the box out, go through and solder down the side of it, solder on the back on the bottom of the motor plate, and then do the front and rear down struts. Do the rear down struts first, then pull the little bullhorn thing here, solder my pieces into that, which I'll go over, and then solder those on. Then it'll be just mounting it to the body. Now that all of these points have been soldered, I'll do the inside on the back of the motor plate there. You could go down the inside as well, but I usually don't, just because I go all the way down the outside. Do that, and then we'll go on to the rear down struts. On these, or on this chassis, unlike the Challenger, I did opt to go with putting the down strut in this position here versus up at the higher position. Again, it's just strictly for more aesthetics in this lower position. That way you don't have to trim out the bumper as much to get it to clear versus up here, and they're up a lot higher into the bumper to get the body to sit down. So when I do that, since it doesn't really have a spot to, as you can see on this one, it kind of holds it in place when you have it there, versus here it kind of doesn't really stay. So I'll just pinch it. I'll kind of stick it right there up against the little bearing housing, kind of pinch it, hold it in place, and then you can kind of move it around and just solder the bottom there. And repeat for the other side. Then at this point, when you just solder the top here, it's a good time, if you want it to be perfectly flat, to go ahead and use something to clamp this, because right now as it's sitting pretty well flat. I run them without clamping them. They'll kind of pull up a little bit when you solder them, which isn't a big deal. I've seen where chassis companies in the past have actually advertised that they build a little bit of an arch into their chassis, and it's supposed to help. I don't know the exact science behind that or anything, or if it actually does help or not, but I do know that if it's not absolutely like perfectly flat with the jig block, it's nothing really to be worried about. It's more like the twisting of the chassis if it's not flat that way versus, if it has a little bit of an arch to it this way. We'll see if this one does when I solder it, if it pulls up a little or not. Stayed fairly flat. You can see just a teeny tiny bit where it kind of pulled. Nothing that I would really worry about. Actually, this is just like a cutting board from Menards. I think I picked up like $16 or something like that. For kind of helps, instead of trying to squeeze it on somewhere on the your actual jig block, you can just lay it flat right on here and then solder as you need. Same thing with the front axle. Take the bullhorn. There's my front down struts. And then on this, just kind of hold it down, and as I'm holding it down, I'll kind of, as you spread it apart there, just kind of hold some pressure on it and kind of hold them in place as you're soldering. Then for the bullhorn itself, actually kind of hold it up, actually like upside down, run a small, just like I did on the bottom of the motor plate, just along the top on the back side. As you can see, just a tiny bit of it pulling it up, but nothing to worry about at all on that. And that is the chassis completely soldered. And then we move on to, I do the front body mount first, then move to the back, then do the front axle tube very last. Alright, and we are on to our body mounting. Going to start with the front first. Had to run and charge my phone to hopefully capture all the rest of this part of the video on enough battery here. But I will go with the front. I know that I'm going to try and keep it a little bit lower, and about in the middle between the wheel opening and the bumper, so somewhere right in here. But I'll kind of eyeball it to get a general idea of how long I want this to be, and then I'll kind of trim it to get it to kind of fit in there where it'll hold itself in. And I'll kind of eyeball it on two different axes, like along the length of the body, and then also this way. That way you can always eyeball and make sure that it's going to be, perfectly centered the way that you want it. Same way when it comes to actually drilling for your pin tubes, or for your actual pins to the pin tube, you'll want to look at it on two different axes down along the body. That way you know if you're drilling directly on, if you look at it directly from the bottom, you might be too high or too low, depending. So if you look at it, from the bottom, line it up, then look at it long ways, and you will be able to tell every single time, and it will be perfect every single time. These drill bits are pretty small and fragile, but right there you can see directly into the pin tube. Then I'll go back later after it's fully mounted and it's completely done, and I'll open up the hole in the body just a little bit. That way it kind of helps with the float on the body itself as well. Put my pin in to hold that side, and then I'll kind of eyeball it again just to double check and make sure that it's still where I want it to be. Looks good. Drill the other side. Looks good there. As you can see, I went straight into the pin tube. And that's exactly perfect. Every single time, as long as you look at it on two different axes, it'll work out just like that every time. And there is the front pin tube mounted to the body. Then this part here, when you are building your own chassis, I would definitely install your either your oil lights or your bearings, whatever you choose to use, and then your wheels and tires. But this one, I've done it so much, I know what it takes just to quickly put a set of, I just use an old set of wheels that the rubber's coming off. But you'll want that to get your center line when you are going to solder your front pin tube on, because once your front pin tube is soldered, that's what locates the chassis inside the body for, for good. So when I take it, flip it over like so, then you can look from the side, see how you want your wheels centered in the rear wheelhouse. This one, since the chassis, the body has such a hard rake onto the chassis, I'll actually take and bend those front two, like the mounting ears for the chassis, I'll kind of bend those up. That way the chassis and the body kind of sit level with each other. So in order to do that, just real quick, put the chassis back on the jig quick. Bolt the guide tongue back down. You could do this a couple different ways, but this just kind of helps me pull it up because it does sit pretty flat against the block. Can't really get a finger under it. Grab it, pull those up. Then I can get a finger under it and still kind of tough. Thin, but it's kind of tough to bend, really. As you can see there, now it's up off of that. Then you can take your body, honestly, that's pretty close on first shot what I would like to see. You can see just a tiny touch of a gap down right at the rocker there where the wheel arch meets the rocker. And it could go down just a little bit actually. And the way that the bumper is up high enough, really won't have to trim a whole lot. You could even leave it right there on your rake. It's got just a teeny tiny touch of rake. For this one, I don't know, I kind of like the way that it looks right there. I'm just going to leave that. I'll push the front down, push these back down just a touch. Kind of lower it down to where that rocker is almost touching. Yeah, that's about perfect there. I'd say that's a pretty decent look to go for. You could lay it all the way flat and keep it real low, but the wheel arch on the rear is so low on these anyways, kind of giving it that rake won't hide so much of that rear wheel once it's in there. But I like the way that looks. I'll put my wheels back in there, that way I can center the axle and actually make sure that the chassis is located perfectly in the body. And there are different ways to do this. You don't have to bend them up. You could use like little brass square tubing and kind of build it up, but that's kind of more along the lines of what you'd have to do with this chassis, since it doesn't really stick out, I guess, straight like this and have area to bend without moving the actual main part of where it's soldered. This is more all soldered together. So if I were to use this chassis and this body, I would have had to use some blocks or some kind of little brass tubing or something like that to space it up just a little bit to get it to be able to mount in the body correctly. Either that or would have had a lot of rake on the body, and then possibly had to shim the guide tongue, which is all okay. It's just all in preference on how you want it done, the way that you want the car to look in the end. So a lot of it's trial and error. You'll mount it, kind of see how it looks. You know, I've been doing this long enough. I know what I want. So it might take you a couple of times to get it to sit how you want. And once you get your actual preference on the way that you like to do it, then it helps make it a little bit quicker and easier. But I like the way that looks. That's what I'm going to stick with on this one here. Grab my wheels for my reference point. Then I kind of like to leave the axle long on one side as well. It kind of helps me judge where the axle is centered in the actual wheel arch itself. But then to center the chassis and the body, I'll actually look on the inside of each of these and then find something on the bumper, like the license plate, frame, the little, what would be the mounting bolts for a real bumper, or like your turn signals. Look at those and you can judge, you know, to center the chassis and the body. Then the actual back and forth, the forward, or, you know, mounting it forward or mounting it further in the back of the body, that's all located directly off of this front as you're mounting it. So center up the front, get a good idea where you want it, at least centered, you know, chassis centered in the body left to right. And then you can look at it sideways and judge where you want, you know, what looks best for your wheel. And obviously this is a small tire. I would run a tall tire in this, but this at least lets you get an idea for the location of the wheel and tire in this chassis and where you're going to mount it in the body. So that's all nice and lined up the way that I want it. And then I'll take and do just 4 quick little tacks of solder on the inside here. The pin tube, you don't want to sit a long time on it to get it to take solder, because before you know it, the pin tube is getting so hot and that little pin is inside there, and then you're melting this big nasty long hole in your body, and then, you know, you're pretty much screwed. You just ruined your whole body. You got to go back and fix it, or, you know, repaint the whole entire car. So you got to be really fast. Don't sit too long and just kind of move around on it until you get it tacked, then pull it back out of the body and then fully solder it. That's about all the longer that I want to stay on there. There, now you can see that it's actually pretty well hinged right on there. It's not soldered very well, so just kind of be gentle when you're pulling the pins. Now you can pull your rear axle and wheels back out. You won't need those until you're actually ready to reassemble the car then. That one actually, when I went to solder it, it did move just a touch, but I saw just exactly how much it did move, so pay attention. And if you're not sure, you can always fit it back in the body just to double and triple check it and make sure that it is right where you want it. But the center I will actually be cutting out then. But I'll go back and do that because I got to trim my little pieces on the back of the chassis, and then I'll actually trim the ends of it as well. That way it gets a little bit of float into the body. And then I will do the same thing, repeat for the rear. Grab this piece, kind of anywhere that you want it along the lines, back in behind the rear wheel where it's going to intersect with the chassis itself. So I'll kind of go back, maybe not quite halfway, maybe somewhere in here. So I'll get an idea of how far, how much I need to get it to be able to fit in with like a press fit like the front, just to be able to hold itself in there while I go to drill the pinholes again. There you can see that rear pin tube is just kind of press fit, holding itself in there. It's right against the chassis when I let it down. Kind of make sure, double check that it does stay right against the chassis. That way when you go to solder it, it'll be pretty well perfect. Now we can do the same for the rear. Go ahead and drill the pin tube. That one, the pin tube slipped out of the way when I bumped it, so, which is okay. I'm glad that it did it, that way I know. So what I'm going to do is actually take my pin the side that is drilled, because it held in place the whole time right up until the very end. So I know that it's lined up where I needed it. And that just makes it kind of hold a little bit, make it easier to kind of put it right back where it needs to go. And then do the same, line it up where you need it. Look on your two axes. That one was a pain. That one popped out both times, but now we'll go ahead and, since it's drilled both sides, go ahead and pin this one. I normally use just a touch bit bigger drill bit, but I broke my last one, so I had to go to the size a little bit smaller, so it's like really tight to get the pin through the body even. But there's that, the rear pin tube. You can actually hear it hitting like perfectly as it's right touching the bumper as well, so make sure that it stays perfectly centered. I'm kind of using the license plate frame in the bumper to kind of center the chassis. And then I'll do the same thing just real quick and do some tacks. That way I'm not melting the body. This one proved to be a little bit harder to mount than usually, but I'm kind of glad that way it shows that it's not even like super easy and fast, even though I've done it a bunch of times. It can be kind of challenging and tricky, but it's rewarding and worth the extra effort to, you know, spend that little bit of attention to detail. There's that. I'll pull the rear pins, pull the front pins, take it out, make sure it's good and soldered. Then, last but not least, move on to the front axle. See, goes to show you when you work fast like that, it doesn't solder real well. Which this happened on the last one actually when I was mounting the body onto the truck. That one, it is pretty tight fit. That's why it kept popping down, because it's spreading the body and it was popping it down. That one had actually kind of stuck in the body when I was pulling it, popped it off. But all you do, just repin the front. Now you have your pinholes already ready to go for your pin tube. Just pin the tube back in. Same way. Just hit it with some more solder real quick and then gently pop it back out. Unlike me, I just kind of tried to pull it out quick and then it popped off. So, trials and tribulations. I'm glad that it's showing this stuff because it just happens. Let's try this again. Since it is such a tight press fit, when you're kind of holding these, it's going to be stuck in there until you actually trim it for the float. So just kind of go slowly on either side. And now the chassis is free out of there. And I'll hit it outside of the car quick. Melt the solder onto it really well. There is front and rear pin tubes fully mounted, fully soldered to the chassis. Last thing to do is the front axle. Then same thing again, kind of get an idea for how wide the opening is on your wheel wells. Mark your pin tube. And then use the cutting board one last time. Then this I just kind of eyeball as well, because I'll end up trimming the ends anyways. So as long as it's close, it'll work. Try and center it the best you can. There's that. And then as you can see here, that's what the acid does to aluminum over time. Turns it all nasty and just eats it away. But I use these specifically for mocking up these chassis. There's that. Now what I want to do is take and mount the body back to the chassis again. It's kind of tricky. This is the more tedious part, the trickier part in my opinion. But just to line it up, if you're not real worried about having your wheels centered perfectly in your wheel openings, it's not as bad, but I like them to be pretty perfect. And again, too, it's kind of a pain right now. I could go ahead and trim these for my float now, which is probably, actually I'm going to, just because this one's such a tight fit into this body. Just because I'm fighting it, I don't want to bend the pin tubes or, you know, snap them off again. So I'm just going to trim a little bit off the ends of these to help it go in and out of the body a little bit easier. Just a little bit more. There's a lot easier to actually put the chassis into the body. Pretty much really lightly. Goes right in. Now I'll take my front axle, just kind of fish it in through, let it kind of hang there, and then put the chassis back onto the jig. Then you can actually take your front axle, this one's being kind of a pain because the body's so low. Kind of line it up. There's markings on the jig. Just get an idea of where it sits. And it's lined up just right. Mine's lined up right about 4.5. Then pull the body back off again, and you know right where you put the chassis back onto the jig, and you know right where your axle center line needs to be to line up perfectly in your body. It's kind of the tough part, kind of a pain in the butt part in my opinion. But that is the last part. There it is. One last little thing is to actually set. I'll take and put it back in the body, check how far in and out, in or out the wheel on the front can sit. And then I'll put a small little bead of solder behind it just to hold it. They do make little collars to solder on that look a little bit cleaner, but I always just do a little drop of solder and it works the same. I won't run them all the way out to the edge of the body. I'll kind of keep them back a little bit for when you have your float dialed in. Then you can have enough room for it to move as well without hitting the wheels. Then I'll put the front pins in the pin tubes. That way when I go to actually cut out this center, it trims the pins to length as well. Then also trim the excess off of the front axle tube. There you can see it actually sits on there, and then when you put your pins, use like a fat head, it sounds funny, fat headed pin tube or a pin, and then that will actually look like a little hub cap on your wheel, and then still allow it to actually spin. Then trim this little bit of excess off on these here. Little spot of solder sticking off, melted it real quick. But that right there is a completed chassis. You can dial in a little bit more float if you'd like, if you want it to move around inside the body a little bit more. And that's just trimming the ends of these pin tubes off. Now you can mount it a little bit differently to where if you put like a bigger tube and then you put your smaller pin tube in it and it will kind of slide inside of it, you could do it that way as well. This way works for me, so that's just how I always do it. But I'll go and wash these off because there's that solder flux all over the place, all over this body, all over this. I'll go wash it quick and show you the final product. I also wanted to show quick as well, I forgot, when I am done with these, I'll actually take it on the Scotch-Brite and kind of clean up the bottom of it. This is like a really fine Scotch-Brite. I normally use the red. It kind of cleans it up a little bit quicker, but it kind of makes the bottom of it a little bit more uniform. And if there's solder that come through on the bottom when you're soldering it on the jig, I'll take and stick a flat piece, or stick a piece of this down on the table here, if it'll stick, because there's a bunch of that acid all over this. Yeah, it's probably not gonna stick, but find a spot where it will. I think I had it sticking over here last time. Yeah, but I'll take and sand it, get rid of that excess solder, and then come back to the Scotch-Brite pad. Kind of helps make it uniform, look uniform from the bottom. There we go, that's looking better. And the very last thing, I'll take a little bit bigger drill bit and drill out the pin tube holes. Helps put the pins in a little bit easier, helps them float in the body a little bit easier. And the importance of float is it acts as a like a shock absorber, since the chassis obviously doesn't have any suspension to it. So it just kind of lets the chassis and the body float separately to kind of absorb a little bit of that shock as it goes down the track. Because if not, if your body is solid mounted, it will actually like hop and skip down the track. And in worst cases, it can actually come off the track, and you know, the car could fly off, could hit the wall, could go flipping and crashing down the track, or could come in contact with another car that you're racing. And a lot of people don't like that. If you have a crazy wild ride and they have an expensive car, you don't want to tear their car up, obviously. And there we have it. That is the end product. Ready for your final running gear and assembly, motor. Get your guide tongue on it, wheelie wheels, and go run. Obviously, I would want to dial more float into it. It essentially has no float, just a tiny bit on the back. But that is what it takes to build an Src Chassis Eliminator Pro.